Well, good morning. I first went to Uganda in 2009. We travelled to a school along an unbelievably bumpy road full of ruts. The taxi driver said, "I couldn't have driven you here yesterday because there was a riot. The government has already agreed the money for a new road. It was part of our MP's election platform. But clearly the road has never been built, and we all know the money's gone straight into his pocket." Yesterday, a crowd gathered outside his house to protest. I said, "That's terrible. Have you no redress? Can't you complain to the president?" "How could the president act against him?" said the taxi driver. "He's doing the very same thing, only on a much bigger scale." It's a story as old as time, isn't it? When graft and corruption are part of the political culture, when people enter politics principally for the financial benefits, pretty soon it becomes very hard to find an honest man or woman. And that's why Daniel is so exceptional, for he is an honest man who's about to be promoted to the top spot in the kingdom, underneath Darius. We're never quite told why his enemies hate him so much. It's probably simply because he'll clamp down on corruption in their districts as strongly as he has in his own. The last person they want to see next to the king is a relentless whistleblower. They rule out reporting him for embezzlement because they know there is none. But perhaps there's another way they can bring Daniel down. While we're talking about stories as old as time, here's another one. The astute servant and the easily deceived master. Think Bertie Wooster and the inimitable Jeeves. Or if you remember, Prince George and Blackadder. That's an example of the servant wrapping his master around his little finger. And that's what the satraps are determined to do here. The trap they knew had to involve his faith. That was the bottom line, and it took them a bit of time, but they landed on it. Why don't we go and see the king and suggest to him that we run King Darius Appreciation Month? For 30 days, no one can ask anything of any god apart from you, O king. Well, it appeals to Darius's vanity, contains a strong element of flattery, doesn't it? You, sire, you alone for a whole month could be the one mediator between us and the gods. Really couldn't go any better. Darius falls straight into the trap, and of course Daniel, as they knew he would, puts his head right in the noose by praying to Yahweh, the God of Israel, at his open window, as he always did. Why exactly was he praying near an open window? Well, it had nothing to do with getting people to look at him. It had everything to do with pointing to Jerusalem. In 1 Kings chapter 8, when the temple is built, Solomon is told, when you are in exile, and they knew it was coming from a long way back, when you are in exile, you were to pray facing towards Israel, to the city God has chosen. In other words, make sure you point towards Jerusalem, and that is exactly what Daniel was determined to do. And of course, by his thrice daily prayer, he was showing everyone that if you wanted to know the difference between him and the corrupt satraps and princes, well, you only had to look at the God to whom he prayed. So why not Daniel just pray in private for 1 month? I mean, it's only 30 days. But once Daniel was put on the spot and told not to pray, well, he believed he had no choice but to continue. Actually, praying in public isn't as odd as it sounds. In cultures where religion is very much the warp and woof of society, or where religion is very strongly respected, it's not at all unusual for people to pray outside. I mean, you can think of the Jews at the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem. They pray openly and publicly there all the time. And of course, we know from the Gospels that in Jesus' day, the Pharisees were well known for praying aloud in public. So, what should that mean to us, this story about Daniel praying at his open window? What are we to make of that? How should we respond? Well, it could be a question for a biblical seminar, but it's one that faced people some years ago very powerfully. National service is not something we've had for many years, but when it was in force, young men had to serve in the army for 2 whole years, and 22 young men were usually placed together in one room. Bullying, I guess, wasn't frowned on in those days. In fact, if anything, it was expected, and don't go whining to an officer. So let me tell you the story of Private Benjamin Lee. It's the first night in the barracks. You can imagine the atmosphere. Everybody's yelling and swearing and doing all the things that young men will do in order to try and establish a pecking order with them as high up as they could possibly get. Some were acting tough because they wanted to be known as the hard case of the barracks. Others just kept their heads down and tried not to draw any attention to themselves. Private Benjamin Lee knew beforehand exactly what he was going to do. He was going to dare to be a Daniel. At home, and it's something we don't do much, of course, these days, but it's something they did then. At home, he had always knelt down by the side of his bed to pray. And he decided he was going to do it right there in that barracks room, in his own personal den of lions. He was very nervous, but he reassured himself. I guess Daniel was nervous too. He probably had butterflies in his stomach when he prayed at his window. So, before lights out, he got down on his knees and prayed beside his bed. Gradually, the room realized something was going on. First of all, a silence began to fall, followed by catcalls and mockery and a lot more swearing. Who's this idiot? Very soon, everyone realized the situation. Someone is actually kneeling down and praying by their bed. The next thing was an avalanche of army boots came flying through the air and hit Private Benjamin Lee very hard. The next night, he did the same thing. And the next. The boots kept flying. But after a while, the number began to decrease. And soon he just had to put up with insults and swearing and people making noises as they walked by. The boots stopped, but the hostility continued. But he had done the right thing, he thought. He had followed the command of the Bible and had dared to be a Daniel. I guess some of the people who mocked him like that probably greatly admired him, or secretly admired him anyway. Who else in the barracks room would find the courage to do what Private Benjamin Lee did? He might have been pretty useless in the boxing ring, but in another sense, Benjamin Lee was the toughest guy in the regiment. And of course, his story was told because he set an example for others going to do their national service to follow. Now, one of my favourite writers was too young for national service, but he asked an older friend, a guy called Simon Asher, how he had managed to maintain his spiritual life in the army. Well, to be honest, he said, I used to go to the loo and lock myself in for longer than I should have done. Locking yourself in the loo, it's a far cry from Private Benjamin Lee. I mean, what kind of example is that? You're supposed to be impressing men with your faith in God, not eliciting sympathy for your constant constipation. The writer says that when he asked the question of Simon Asher, he appeared a little shamefaced. But I wonder, should he have done? Did Simon Asher simply flunk the test? Did he fail to be a Daniel? Was he just not the stuff of which martyrs were made? Well, before we write him off, let's think again about the question. Why he's doing this. For the Bible has more to say about praying in public than the story of Daniel. Listen to this from Jesus himself. But when you pray, go into your room and shut the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. A lot there about shutting doors and praying in secret, isn't there? This verse is a direct instruction from Jesus not to do what the Pharisees did. Don't pray in public. Don't pray in front of people. But on the contrary, pray in a private place where you can be alone. You see, in a culture where religion was respected, there was always that pit that people could fall into, the temptation to show off, to display your spirituality like a bowerbird or a peacock. The Pharisees in Jesus' day wore long robes so that no one could miss them in the streets and squares where they prayed. But even though their prayers were ostensibly directed at God above, they were actually aimed at those in the streets around them. That's why Jesus says, go into your room and lock the door, for in there it is just you and God and no one else. There will be no temptation for you to show off your spiritual prowess in there. In fact, you'll find out just how real your prayers actually are, because God already knows. So now we have two biblical principles, and they appear to be directly in conflict with each other. Number one, when you pray, open the window. Number two, when you pray, close the door. Well, let's ask the question, why did Simon Asher pray in that loo? I don't think he was being a coward. He was actually obeying Jesus, who prayed frequently. Simon Asher believed his time with God was hugely important. If he was going to pick up his cross and follow Jesus in that place for 2 long years, he needed to meet with God every day. He obeyed Jesus literally in his loo. When you pray, go into a small room and lock the door. So who was right? The very public Benjamin Lee, or the more hidden away Simon Asher? What do you think? It's a difficult question. Quite recently, I was delighted to come upon this passage from a Christian pastor who was discussing this very issue from his own experience of those going into national service. How should they conduct their prayer lives? In public, like Benjamin Lee, or in private, like Simon Asher? This is his view. He says this: I often advise young men going into the forces not to take the advice given to them by their church leaders. Young men are often told by a senior Christian, when you get into the forces, the very first night you get on your knees in that barracks in front of them all. Make sure you get your flag up and get your standards set. He goes on. Jesus taught that is precisely not the way to show people you are a Christian. Jesus said, don't pray in public, don't parade your prayer. It is the most dangerous thing to do, because if you do it, you will find that you are constantly thinking much more of the people watching you than you ever are of God. Setting up your flag, you see, is not what we're called to do in prayer. We're there to meet with God. By the end of his 2 years in the army, everyone knew Simon Asher was a Christian. It had come out in his everyday life, in his speech, and in his actions. So, to sum up, well, who could fail to admire the wonderful Benjamin Lee and his courageous and resolute faith? He reminds me of Charles Spurgeon, who said of Daniel, the reason the lions didn't eat Daniel was that they could tell that he was 50% backbone and 50% grit. Well, if that was the case, so was Private Lee. But Simon Asher lived 2 years as a Christian, living out his faith very openly. He prayed in private in his loo, but he lived in public for his Lord. He was in every way like a city set on a hill. I got a prayer book from college. In the front, the principal wrote this: it's a reminder that a life of prayer is the essential foundation for fruitful ministry and life as a Christian. Well, that's certainly what Simon Asher believed.